for your patience this afternoon. I'm going to cut my presentation in half since we're so far behind, so I'll just try to go for about 10 minutes. I work for Veritas Group, which is a sustainability consulting company, and we help organizations reduce their environmental footprint. That's kind of a quick way to say what we do. And I want to talk with you today about building resilience to climate change, both on a community scale and on a personal scale. I am trained actually as an ordained minister, and I started out in bringing ministry together with sustainability, and I worked as a minister of sustainability at First Plymouth Church here for 5 years, and then transitioned into the sustainability and climate world, working here at the university for a while. In fact, that middle picture was taken in this room at a conference a few years ago, and now working on the consulting side of things. So I'm going to skip this part. This is going to be an imaginative exercise, imagining Lincoln, Nebraska in 2050 and what kinds of climate impacts we might experience. But I am starting to do climate resiliency planning. I'm just finishing up my first climate resilience plan that I helped the community of Spearfish, South Dakota create. And we've been working on that for the last year. It has been a really fascinating process. And I am so excited to do more climate resiliency planning work with communities because it just unleashes a lot of creativity and fascinating problem solving. The definition of resilience that we use is this rather technical version from the IPCC. But basically the definition of resilience is the capacity to bounce back from a disturbance, which we all kind of know is the definition of resilience. But more than that is also to create the capacity to continue to adapt to change in a dynamic environment. So you gather the skills to bounce back and also the skills to continue to adapt to change, which is the environment that we are increasingly now in as the climate is changing. The process that we go through in creating a climate resiliency plan is this one. We basically assemble a task force, and it needs to be a very cross-sectoral task force, including emergency response personnel, business personnel, school district people, university people, a very nice wide cross-section of the community. We do a lot of information gathering on past climate events, projected climate impacts. Then we go through a climate resilience assessment process where we would assess the projected climate impacts to a community and then overlay those with demographic information so that we can identify, for example, the incidence of heavy downpours is increasing and is projected to continue to increase in this area. And the floodplain maps that we have may have been drawn according to the floods of the past, not according to the floods of the future. And so we could look at those floodplain maps and look at where the most vulnerable communities lie and how they might be impacted by extreme downpour events. That's one example. You could also look at heat stress issues, heavy snow events, increasing storms, and drought, of course. So then from that process, we identify the most important vulnerabilities in the community. We also identify the strengths that the community has to respond to those issues. And then we set goals to increase resilience to those particular vulnerabilities that have been identified. And from there, we develop strategies and create a plan and then continue to build capacity in the community. I know that not all of you are Lincoln residents, but the most important issues for us right here are rising summer temperatures, more frequent droughts. We've talked a lot about water already, of course, today, and water is probably the most important issue for this community for two reasons. One, because the snowpack in the Rocky Mountains is projected to decrease as the climate continues to change, which will most likely decrease our water availability. And also here in Lincoln, we get our drinking water from the Missouri River, which is pretty far away from a community, or from the Platte River right now, and maybe in the future from the Missouri River. So that, and as we just saw in the aftermath of the flood, our whole community's drinking water supply was on very tenuous ground for a couple of days because the electricity was cut to the pumps that bring our water to Lincoln. So the city of Lincoln is already in conversation with Omaha's water district about forming a regional water partnership, because Omaha has plenty of water, apparently. And so if we can build an extremely expensive pipeline to get that water to Lincoln, we will be a much more resilient community. But anyway, that's one big issue. And you can see a list of several other issues that are on the docket. So my personal and professional hope is that the City of Lincoln will take on a climate resiliency planning process and really start to engage all of these issues head on. The thing that's really wonderful about a climate resiliency planning process is that it not only does these kind of practical things I'm mentioning, but it also establishes a vision of thriving in the midst of challenges. It brings diverse community members together to identify gaps and identify solutions to those gaps. It was remarkable in the process that I've been through in South Dakota, just getting the right people in the room and getting them to talk to each other, which sounds like such a simple thing, was really a huge thing, because you just got to understand how one organization does things and how that might complement how another organization does things. And all of a sudden, you've created an opening to build some important resiliency. It also, one of the things I really like about it, it gets people excited. I think so many people feel a sense of dread and despair about climate change. A lot of people, like people in this room, are aware of what's coming, but they don't know what to do about it. But when you start to work on resiliency efforts, there's this sense of rolling up your sleeves and becoming part of the solution. And I think there's a huge psychological benefit to that, as well as being a community benefit. And it encourages innovation, and it also creates a stronger community in terms of addressing things that probably should have been addressed anyway, in terms of making a stronger, more resilient community, but now you really have the impetus to do these things. So I think it can be a really wonderful thing. So I want to switch gears now for the next couple of minutes to talk about personal resiliency. And this is kind of a new cutting edge area for me to be working on. This is kind of brings my past as a minister, working with communities on sort of spiritual or emotional peace and collaboration. I've started to work with a group of women that includes Mary Piper, the New York Times bestselling author who lives here in Lincoln and who's a big environmentalist. She and another woman named Judy Greenwald and I have started to lead retreats based on the work of Joanna Macy. Joanna Macy is a Buddhist eco-philosopher who's been working for many decades, mostly at the she started working at the intersection of nuclear war or nuclear fallout, actually working with communities who had been affected by nuclear radiation, so who had basically experienced a kind of despair event. And she started working with them about how to build hope out of that catastrophic experience. And so through many, many decades of doing this work and then kind of transitioning her work to working on climate change, she has developed a sort of a technology of group facilitation, you might say, a lot of kind of guided exercises that help people really think differently about their circumstances and about their role in this time in history. So I have, when we do our small group breakout at the end of the day, I have some flyers and some more information about those retreats. We are planning to continue to lead them, and I have a sign-up sheet if you'd like to be notified about those in the future. But I just wanted to say a little bit about building personal resiliency. And as we know, we've just gotten through a really the worst natural disaster in our state's history, which is what they're saying. The flood that happened was what they call a 500-year flood, which means it's a flood that has a 0.2% chance of occurring in any given year. Our farmers were already struggling with difficult ag economy, and now this happens on top of it. So what is expected to increase are issues such as depression, anxiety, traumatic stress, and substance abuse. And even before such a stress-causing incident, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has noted that there are higher suicide rates in rural areas, and all other concerns are the opioid crisis and high levels of binge drinking. The floods now may have stripped many farmers' land of the soil that it needs to grow crops, which could take years in some cases to return to production. Some of those farmers were storing grain they had been storing grain for several years to wait till the grain price, the commodity prices came back up to sell, but the floodwaters inundated that stored grain in many cases and contaminated it, and flood insurance does not cover that stored grain, as I understand it. So there's a real crisis right now, a potential crisis in terms of the mental health of our Nebraska farmers and ranchers. And I wanted to put this slide up. If any of you know or are connected in your families or friends with farmers and families who are maybe struggling with mental health issues, the University of Nebraska has put up this whole website called flood.unl.edu, and this is a page, this is just a screenshot of the page that has a whole series of mental health resources. There are extension educators and there's a hotline, people willing to reach out and help people with these issues. So please spread that around if you need it. This is Joanna Macy, who I was telling you about. The work that she has created, she calls the work that reconnects. So if you'd like to look her up later and read more about her, I would encourage you to do so. And I just have like 5 tips, so to speak, for increasing personal resiliency. And this is kind of the stuff we cover in our retreats, but not in this sort of corporate way. Anyway, the first tip is to assess the situation honestly. This is just a graph that shows projected temperature increases for Nebraska in terms of climate change. And we all need to really look honestly at the projected impacts for where we live and really understand what is coming down the pipe. That's kind of the first step. The next step is to take constructive action. As I said a few minutes ago, rolling up your sleeves and getting involved is going to make you feel better about the crisis, and it's also going to allow you to help others. Connecting with others is a really key piece too, whether it's in a kind of spiritual mode like this, praying together with others, or simply talking about it. I have noticed in my ministry work that people are harboring a great sense of despair and grief about what is happening to the natural world right now. But we tend not to have spaces in our world to talk about that. And that's also why we're leading these retreats. We really want to create spaces for people to be able to voice what's on their heart. But you might be able to create those spaces with friends or family as well. I think also, I don't know if it's ironic or not, but one of the best ways to address our despair about the natural world is to actually spend time in the natural world, in healthy and vibrant places that give you life. And it can be a really soul-nourishing practice to remind you of what's most important. And related to that, this is one thing that Joanna Macy's work does, it's the invitation to think in terms of deep time. Deep time means basically geological time. It's not thinking in terms of a human lifetime or a work week or whatever, but thinking in terms of millions of years. And thinking in terms of our ancestors who came, maybe 7 generations before us, and what did they do to allow us to live here today? And then importantly, thinking 7 generations into the future. And how are our actions going to leave a legacy for those who come after us? And we know that none of us have the ability to snap our fingers and create that perfect and sustainable world. But we do have the opportunity to contribute to some kind of through line of sustainability or love or justice that will hopefully continue into the future. So those are just a few brief thoughts from me. Here's my contact information. Feel free to contact me, and we'll talk more at the breakouts at the end of the day. Thank you.